Check out FlipsideGaming.com for all your gaming needs. Use the promo code HEROES to save 10% on all orders over $10 and support the channel at the same time. Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to this special edition of the Magic the Gathering Market Watch, where we're going to check in on the current pricing of Guilds of Ravnica cards. We're going to see which ones are hot, which ones are cold, after the first weekend of competitive play, as well as about a week now since the cards have been released. Quickly before we get started though, just a fast reminder, if you check out the description below, you'll find a few ways to help support what we do here at the channel, one of which is our Patreon page. You're also going to find links to products on Amazon down below. If you make any purchases, actually no matter what it is, once you go through that link, we'll get a small percentage for the channel. And finally, Flipside Gaming still offering a promo code for our viewers. Hopefully you can save some cash while you support the channel. They're currently doing pre-orders for the Guilds of Ravnica guild kits as well there. And as always, thank you not only to the folks that look at those links, but to all the viewers. Y'all make the channel what it is, but let's get into it. Before we get to our top 10s, there's a few cards that are not found in the booster packs I just want to highlight for a moment. The first is Rawl's Dispersal, down 42 cents to 57 cents. And this is the card that interacts with Rawl in that Planeswalker deck. You'll notice that this, as well as the card that interacts with Vraska, are both going down pretty sharply this week. The reason I bother to point it out is just simply because sometimes, even though these cards aren't necessarily great for competitive standard play, there are a lot of casual players or commander players that just go into the secondary market. They pick up the Planeswalkers from the Planeswalker decks as singles, and then sometimes they'll want to pick this up as well. So just a heads up for anyone who's in that market. And here's the Vraska one. Vraska Stoneglare down 58 cents to 52 cents. And then finally, Impervious Great Worm is down $3.10 this week to $8. This is the Buy a Box promo. A card that's not seeing any competitive standard play, really don't anticipate it seeing play there, so this will continue to come down. Okay, let's move into our top 10 Guilds of Ravnica cards that have lost value this week. Number 10, Teshik Legion's Edge, down 36 cents to $2.69. So this one's going down. It's not going down a whole lot. It is a rare, so as packs are being opened this week, there's a lot more entering circulation compared to Mythics generally. However, this card did see success over the course of the weekend. Looked great in those Boros aggro builds, and we saw copies of this in the top 8 of the standard tournaments. We also saw this in a humans deck that came in first place in the Team Trios event at Star City Games Columbus, believe it or not. It was just a one-of, but still it was in there, so this is a card to pay attention to for the future. Number 9, Nullhide Ferox, down 42 cents to $8.98. This card had some buzz going into that first weekend, but didn't put up any huge results. Now, Steelleaf Stompy actually didn't put up any huge results this weekend, so that's probably part of the reason we didn't see a lot of this card. But I don't know, I'm still not sold that the card is good enough, even though it's cheap and it is a little bit difficult to deal with at times, especially early on in the game if you can ramp into it. It's also a 6/6, it doesn't have evasion or trample, and there's some successful tokens decks out there, which makes this awkward. I don't know if it really gets there, but it's definitely one to keep an eye on. Number 8, Mnemonic Betrayal, down 47 cents to $2.18. This is the second Mythic in a row going down in value today on our list. Now this one I didn't have a lot of confidence in. The casting cost of 3 just felt like too much of a startup cost for competitive standard, and then you have to have something worthwhile casting in your opponent's graveyard at that given time, and you still have to have enough mana available to do it. Even though color isn't a consideration, which is nice, it still felt like it was asking a lot, so I don't really see it doing anything there. I do think this is a really cool commander card still though, because in Commander, you will have more targets, and you'll also have more mana to use on those targets. You could have a big turn with a card like this occasionally, especially with all the really juicy cards that could be in graveyards in that format. So I do think at some point this does maybe stabilize and pick up a little bit because of the Commander crowd. Number 7, March of the Multitudes, down 53 cents to $14. Now this card saw a pretty nice spike going into the weekend, and that's why it's rescinding a little bit right now, even though it did great last weekend in Standard. Celestia Tokens decks look phenomenal. This was a key part of them. As a matter of fact, the first and second place teams in the team event at Star City Games Columbus were both running this as their standard deck. So that's pretty significant. Even so, it does still go down this week. Expected to stabilize relatively quickly, though. Number 6, Lazav the Multifarious, down 73 cents to $5.27. I have seen some Grixis decks trying to run this in standard, although the Grixis control deck that performed the best last weekend was not running this card. And because of that, it gets a little bit soft. It's going down. We'll have to see if it does anything in the future. Now, I don't have high hopes for this in standard, honestly, but I do think much like Mnemonic Betrayal, this could be a really solid commander card in the future. This is one you might want to keep an eye on. If you can pick them up cheap, you might want to grab a copy. Number 5, Divine Visitation, down 79 cents to $5.50. Another Mythic losing value. Quite a few on our list today. Now, This one I didn't have a lot of high expectations for in Standard. Again, much like some of the other cards we talked about, I just felt like the setup cost here is too much. Yes, there are some ways to get tokens the same turn that it comes into play, sure. But waiting to turn 5 minimally to do this just didn't feel really good in the Standard environment. These red decks and these Boros decks are just blistering fast. You don't have time to set stuff up like this, unfortunately. Now, with that being said, this has seen some play in Selesnya Tokens decks. However, the more successful variants of that deck so far are not running this, but it is something to keep an eye on for the future. I do think, though, outside of Standard, this is another really solid commander card. I'd like to put this in a Selesnya Tokens deck for sure. Number 4, Vraska, Golgari Queen, down $1.11 to $11.67. Now, the Golgari midrange deck actually had a pretty good weekend, but a lot of people were expecting more from that deck, and I think some people expected this card to show up in higher frequencies within those deck builds than we did see. Many of the successful ones just running a copy of this, but still, we did see a Golgari midrange deck in the top 8 of the team trios. We also saw one in the top 8 of the Standard Classic. So the deck's not doing bad. In fact, you saw a lot of them just missing top 8s as well. So I do think as people retool and figure out how to best make this deck efficient, you will see more copies doing better. Also, that deck did get overshadowed this weekend by maybe some of the more surprising decks like Mono Red Aggro, which a lot of people had counted out. Also, the Boros decks did really well, the Selesnya Tokens decks. So this one wasn't on top of everybody's mind. Hence, this card goes down a little bit. I'd keep an eye on it, though, in the future. Number 3, Mission Briefing, down $1.79 to $5.98. I see various control builds running this card. However, much like some of the other cards we're talking about today, the ones that did the best last weekend were not running this card, which is a little bit awkward for it, and because of that, it's going down in value. Couple that with this one's actually a rare, not a mythic, and not too unexpected that you see a little bit of a price drop here. Number 2, yep, it's Assassin's Trophy, down $2.49 to $21.36. Well, first off, this thing was $25 during the pre-release time. We knew that price had to come down. So it is adjusting down a little bit. It's still well over $20. However, it did not see the amount of play a lot of people were anticipating in that first weekend. It saw a lot of play as a matter of fact, but those most successful decks, you didn't see a lot of copies, at least in the standard decks. So what you ended up finding was that in the Star City Games Classic, there was one copy in the top 8s. In the Star City Games standard decks in the open, you had no copies in the top 8. So that's a little bit underwhelming for a card that had so much hype, right? What about other formats? Well, when you look at the Modern and Legacy decks that were in the top 8 in Columbus, you did find 2 copies of this in a Dredge deck out of the sideboard in Modern, and you found 1 copy of this in Legacy in a Punishing Abzan deck out of the sideboard. So there are some successful decks beginning to run this, and when it's week 1 of a card coming out and it's showing up in Modern and Legacy decks, you do want to pay attention to it. Now, aside from those decks that were in the top 8, yes, this card actually did see a lot of play in many other decks. You saw a lot of Golgari, Abzan mid-range decks running this out there in Standard. You also saw a number of other decks in Modern and Legacy trying it out too. So we'll have to see what happens over the coming weeks. I wouldn't panic and say, wow, this card's going to be a dud or anything like that, but I do think it will come down more in the next few weeks. Number 1, Pellet Collector, down $2.99 to $7.32. Now, this card had a huge surge last week, and that's part of the reason you're seeing some snapback here. It did have a really big spike. It is a rare. A lot of copies are entering the marketplace now as well. So we expected this kind of retraction. Now, with that being said, we'll have to see what happens with this card going forward. Standard, it didn't have an amazing week, again, because Steel Leaf Stompy decks didn't have an amazing week. And that Magic 8 Suicide Zoo deck for Modern, it's a little too early yet to call if that's going to be a Tier 1 deck or not. But if it does, and it has a chance because the deck looks very solid, then this card will quickly stabilize and start increasing, no doubt. Alright, let's move on to the top 10 Guilds of Ravnica cards that have gained value this week. Number 10, Temple Garden, up 44 cents to $6.62. One of 3 Shocklands you're going to see on the list today. Not too surprising. Now, I will say this, even though you see some of these going up in price, even if it is just a little bit, like in this example, don't panic. These are going to stabilize quickly and go down as packs get open. They are rares. They are not mythics. The only reason you're seeing an increase this week on some of these is simply because people are scrambling to build the decks they saw on Saturday and Sunday. And if they don't already have some copies of these, they're just willing to pay for them to get them in their collection and build the decks. Now, once that scramble ends, everything will settle down nicely, so these will have a little bit of a peak over the next week or two before they slide. Number 9, Ritual of Soot, up 47 cents to $1.89. This was a card that a lot of people weren't thinking about going into the weekend, but it looked very solid in various control builds and did see top 8 play as well, so I do think this one could climb a little bit more in the coming weeks. Number 8, Runaway Steamkin up 51 cents to 571. Mono red aggro, I'll tell you. That deck is not going away. A lot of people thought that it was losing a lot of pieces and it could disappear, but that simply is not the case. It did lose a lot of important cards, but it kept so many good ones. You got Goblin Chain Whirlers, you got Rekindling Phoenix, Lightning Strike, Shock. These are all very solid cards. There's a whole new group of cards coming in behind to backfill the ones that we lost, and this is one of them. This is also good in those Boros aggro decks too. Number 7, speaking of Boros, Aurelia, Exemplar of Justice, up 54 cents to $15. Now, this card looked amazing this weekend in Boros aggro decks and Boros Angel decks. Very, very solid card. This will see a lot of play this standard season, I have no doubt. Number 6, Watery Grave, up 76 cents to $9.25. Okay, this is our second shock land on the list. We already saw Temple Garden, which of course was gaining a little steam thanks to Selesnya tokens and some of those Abzan builds. Watery Grave wants to be in a number of control builds, so right now this one is a little bit hot this week. Number 5, Arclight Phoenix, up 91 cents to $4. This didn't have like an amazing weekend or anything like that, but there's a lot of buzz around this card for future decks that could perform well in the coming weeks. For example, Is It Control? There's some builds running this. We've seen some Is It Drake decks, some mono red decks running this as well, like spell-centric decks, wizard decks. So I do think there's at least some potential that this card could get there still, even though we didn't see a lot of it in the big decks in week 1. So this is one to keep an eye on. Number 4, Overgrown Tomb, up 93 cents to $7.94. So the shock land moving the most this week is in Golgari colors. Definitely wants to be part of those Golgari mid-range decks or Abzan mid-range decks. But like I said earlier, I do think those decks do have to step it up a notch in the coming weeks, or they could fall by the wayside. Number 3, Experimental Frenzy, up 241 to $4.94. This is a card that a lot of people were a little skeptical about going into the first weekend, but I knew this was going to be a solid card in some of those mono red aggro decks if they could get there. That's exactly what we saw. Basically, those decks can just dump their hand, play this card, and even though it costs 4, you're still kind of getting a cantrip out of it because you now can play the top card of your library, which is kind of sweet. And then you have just big turns going forward from time to time. Play a land off the top of your library, play a shock, play a creature, and you could have like a couple cards come off the top of your deck per turn. It gets insane, and it looked really good on camera last weekend. Also, Boros aggro decks are running this, sometimes out of the sideboard more often though, but those mono red decks right in the main deck, and it looks very, very good. Number 2, another card for mono red, Risk Factor, up $3.96 to $9.15. Another one that I had talked a lot about going into this weekend. I just feel like this is such a solid card for that strategy. Whether it's mono red or Boros aggro, if you can put fast pressure on an opponent, neither one of these choices is going to be very good for them. And I'm usually not a very big fan of the card that gives the opponent the choice, but in this case, if you follow the right strategy, this is going to be bad for them either way. Number 1 is Doom Whisperer, up $4.96 to $24.94. This card's kind of interesting. We've actually seen this show up in various mid-range and control builds, but again, it didn't have a huge weekend last weekend if you look at top 8s. So because of that, you would think the card might get a little soft, but I do think there's still a lot of confidence in it because the card itself is still very solid. I think the problems we saw might have been with some deck builds, but not with this particular card. So I have no doubt that this will see success in the coming weeks. Also, another thing propping up this price point is Commander. This is a phenomenal Commander card. First off, it's a real solid creature, 6/6 for 5 flying trample, but pay 2 life to survive 2. That's going to be fantastic in Commander where you have extra life to play with. And if you want to populate your graveyard a little bit, maybe reanimate, there's just a lot of big plays that this card can lead to. So because of that, this card has a very big spike this week. All right, with that being said, that is our look at Guilds of Ravnica. Now, Saturday, we're going to do our regular market watch where we're going to look at everything else aside from Guilds of Ravnica. So you'll find out what all these other cards are doing in standard, modern, as well as some vintage cards. We'll do our Commander highlight as we always do. But until next time, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.